On behalf of the Department of English, University of Gour, Banga, I welcome you all to this new session of the online lecture series that we are organizing. The department is actually doing its bit to mitigate the losses resulting from the suspension of our regular classes. And this online lecture series is a part of that initiative. And you will be happy to know that the Interdisciplinary Study Circle of the Department of English from today is also organizing a 7-day workshop on research preparation in interdisciplinary literary studies. So we are today very happy to have in our midst Professor Scott Slovic, University Distinguished Professor of Literature and Environment at the University of Idaho, United States. He has taught at the University of Nevada also. How do I actually introduce Scott? He has been a builder of bridges, connecting literature with environment. He is a globetrotter, an academic globetrotter. He has been to even the far-flung regions of the earth. He has been a Fulbright scholar to China, Japan, Germany, and he is going to Turkey for another stint as a Fulbrighter. And he has written, edited, and co-edited quite a number of books. And he has over 200 articles to his credit. Now, we all know that he is one of the pioneering figures in the field of eco-criticism, environmental criticism. Today, he is going to talk about the convergence between medical and environmental humanities during a period of eco-precarity that the coronavirus has forced us to. So without further ado, let me now request Professor Scott Slovic to address us. It's over to you, Scott.
Thank you very much. I assume that my microphone is working. I appreciate that warm welcome, and it's a pleasure to spend some time talking with you today. I'm tempted to say this evening because it is actually Sunday evening, my time, in the Western American state of Oregon, although I know it's Monday morning over in West Bengal. But it's a great pleasure to be with you and to share some thoughts with you, as you just heard, about the convergence of medical and environmental humanities during a time of pandemic crisis. I don't know, I think most of you are from the University of Gour, Banga, and you may not necessarily have heard me give similar versions of this lecture elsewhere. But if you have heard another version of this talk, I apologize for treading some familiar ground, but many of you may be listening to this for the first time. It's actually a little bit strange to me to hear myself described as a globetrotter, because like many of you, I believe, I'm hardly traveling at all these days. During this pandemic, we're really not traveling. I have not been on an airplane at all in this year. And so I'm really not much of a globetrotter right now, except online in this manner. And I have visited India 5 or 6 times in recent months through this virtual medium. But anyway, it's just a pleasure to be with you. At this time in history, we seem to be struggling with so many overlapping and intersecting crises: social, medical, environmental, economic, and political crises. Most recently, in my part of the world, we've been responding to unprecedented wildfires. I don't know how many of you have heard of what's happening in the Western United States right now. These wildfires or as we call them. In other places, they might call them bushfires, like as in Australia. These fires are caused by lightning storms and sometimes by high winds tipping over electrical power lines, combined with tinder dry forests that have received far less rainfall than in past years. And the raging wildfires have caused dreadful air quality problems, with the recent AQI, Air Quality Index, in the city of Eugene, Oregon, where I am at the moment, reaching nearly 500. Normally, the AQI here is perhaps 20 or 25. The lower number, the better. So normally 25, recently almost 500 because of the incredible fires in this part of the world. I believe Eugene and other nearby cities had the worst air quality in the world 2 weeks ago due to the wildfire smoke. Oregon has long been known in the United States as one of the most environmentally progressive regions in the country, a place that works hard to protect its beautiful coastline, its famous mountains, its wild rivers, and its lush forests. But in recent weeks, these same forests have gone up in flames, producing so much smoke that it's been hazardous to leave one's home. Living in Oregon lately has really brought to light the idea that environmental issues and public health issues are deeply integrated. What I'd like to talk about today is this convergence, specifically in relation to the work of the humanities. As the saying goes, we're facing a perfect storm these days with regard to the combination of crises we're grappling with in the United States and elsewhere in the world. It's really hard to see how we're going to make progress in a practical sense in resolving the many challenges we're facing right now throughout the world. It's also sometimes hard to see how the arts and humanities can play a useful role in providing something our fellow human beings need when we're all dealing with such dire and overwhelming problems, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, the loss of many jobs, and the possibility of even more severe economic collapse, massive social unrest due to systemic racism and police brutality, no apparent also an apparent political pandemic of rampant dictatorships or quasi-dictatorships erupting in many countries, even here in the United States, some would say, and the crises go on and on. This is not even to mention the devastating environmental crises, from toxic pollution to extinction to the overarching threat of global climate change. The situation we're in September 2020 is really as stressful and worrisome as any predicament I can remember experiencing in my lifetime. So where do we begin as we try to think about these many planetary crises? Some of you may have heard a talk that I gave in May at the online conference on imagining a post-coronavirus world hosted by Oro University. At that time, I suggested a number of potential responses to the coronavirus pandemic, mostly psychological responses that I thought could be opportunities for people to learn something from this particular crisis, the pandemic, but also perhaps from the other varieties of crisis or layers of crisis we're experiencing at this time. I listed several examples in that earlier talk of what I called COVID mind, by which I meant ways of thinking inspired by the COVID crisis that might actually be beneficial to our ongoing survival as a species, enabling us to adapt to this world of uncertainty, of worries and uncertainties. Specifically, I suggested that these psychological or cognitive tendencies might include the following. 1, a sense of universal vulnerability. 2, a heightened awareness of the human mind's insensitivity to exponential and potentially catastrophic change. 3, a growing awareness that our interactions with the animal world have genuine consequences for human beings, such as in the zoonotic transmission of disease. And 4, an appreciation of what it means to put on the socio-cultural brakes and change the way we live, to actually come to a halt and stop living as usual and try to imagine and enact changes in our lives. Again, these 4 points are 4 ideas are points that I made in a talk at the beginning of May, more than 4 months ago. And in today's talk, I wanted to dig more deeply into the specific idea of universal sense of vulnerability, which I've called ecoprecarity in the title of my talk today, using the term developed by Professor Pramod K. Nayar from Hyderabad University. And I also wanted to talk a little bit today about the potential conjunction of the medical humanities and the environmental humanities, especially vis-a-vis the COVID pandemic. In my earlier talk, and in some other essays I've written in recent months, I've highlighted the strangely paradoxical psychological dimension of the pandemic, at least in my own experience, describing the paradox as one where I seem to be living my life these days in a dissonant condition of normalcy and peril. I know there are a lot of dangerous things out in the world. In fact, there's a kind of implicit danger these days, even in standing too close to my neighbors and possibly sharing specks of contaminated bodily fluids merely by speaking to friends. To think this way is really strange, isn't it? And yet it's become the new normal for all of us. Ecoprecarity is the idea, accentuated by certain kinds of cultural texts, that we live in a world where human beings and other living organisms are vulnerable to various threats. As Pramod K. Nayar, whom I'll discuss further in a minute, puts it, precariousness is the effect of an exposure to the world which then inflicts injury. And ecoprecarity emphasizes the idea that our own vulnerability may be caused by threats from the natural environment, and the idea that the environment itself may be vulnerable in various ways. We started the new academic year at the University of Idaho about 4 weeks ago, after months of fretting about whether or not the university would have in-person classes this fall or would move entirely to remote online teaching, as many American universities have done. I myself have never felt comfortable with the risk of resuming in-person classes at this time, knowing that the threat of a major spike in COVID cases continues to exist. But the university administrators in Idaho have given in to political and economic pressures and have insisted on holding as many face-to-face classes as possible. However, they also created a new hybrid course delivery category called HighFlex classes, in which professors can use their judgment in offering a mixture of in-person and virtual class sessions. I'm teaching my one HighFlex class this fall via Zoom, and I do not intend to be in the same room as my students unless by some fluke there is a viable vaccine for the virus in the next 3 months. I'm simply not willing to take the risk of being infected with COVID by one of my students, or possibly sharing anything I've been exposed to with them. When I went to my office at the beginning of the semester, for the first time in months, there was a plastic face shield waiting for me and for my faculty colleagues. But I don't plan to need the shield because I'll be teaching remotely, and all of my faculty meetings will also be held remotely. This is all a response to my perception of the risk of COVID-19 and my unwillingness to behave in ways that seem reckless and unnecessarily dangerous. When I first wrote about the strange psychological balance between normalcy and peril that many of us are experiencing during the pandemic, we had only a few thousand known COVID cases, COVID deaths in the United States. This is back in May or so. Today, when I checked, the Centers for Disease Control said that we have had nearly 6.8 million cases in this country and more than 199,000 deaths, nearly 200,000 COVID deaths in the US as of today. India, I believe, has had nearly 5.5 million cases and some 87,000 fatalities. When I wrote about the COVID pandemic 5 months ago, I expressed surprise that there is a kind of normalcy to our lives, even in the midst of the COVID crisis. However, I also acknowledge at the same time I find myself thinking about the peril of our species in a more acute and visceral way than was previously the case, even though I know that the world is fraught with peril, with risk and danger, with uncertainty. I wrote that it seems to me that we should carry away from the current moment the powerful idea that so-called normalcy and so-called peril coexist paradoxically in an uneasy tension. Today's paradoxical mindset should, I think, be part of what I call the COVID mind, a way of thinking that helps us to be sensitive to the serious threats we and others are facing in the world, even if we do not feel ourselves to be in immediate danger of suffering death or loss in a given moment. To me, normalcy enables us to conduct our daily lives with a certain effectiveness, but peril should keep us on our toes, vigilant and concerned. We are all vulnerable. Some of the best thinking I've encountered on the subject of vulnerability is in the work of Professor Nayar, which I mentioned earlier. Pramod Nayar has published 2 recent books on different aspects of precarity, both from social justice and environmental perspectives. These are the 2017 book titled Bhopal's Ecological Gothic, Disaster, Precarity, and the Biopolitical Uncanny, and the 2019 publication Ecoprecarity, Vulnerable Lives in Literature and Culture. The earlier book about Bhopal argues that the terrible Union Carbide chemical accident of 1984 has continued to haunt society for more than 30 years, characterizing Bhopali lives and perhaps stimulating public concern about the dangers of industrial society and the unethical practices of multinational corporations in externalizing the risks and costs of their activities. Nayar focuses in particular on the Gothic quality of the art and literature that have emerged from the 1984 disaster, a quality that results in a kind of unsettling psychological affect, a feeling of disquiet. This is a good thing, as I understand it, the way disaster texts, such as the tradition of Bhopal-related work, enables us to be concerned about an event that occurred long ago to people far away, and enables us potentially to exert our voices, our economic actions, and our votes to prevent future such occurrences. The cultural representation of vulnerable Bhopali lives has the potential to create enhanced public awareness of an ongoing ecological and biopolitical threat. Nayar points to such artistic works as Indra Sinha's 2007 novel, Animals, People, as the chief examples of cultural texts that gothicize the Bhopali experience, creating an uncanny sensation for readers because the reality represented there is both familiar and strange. In a sense, this uncanniness may be what I'm trying to explain when I speak about the simultaneous sense of normalcy and peril that characterizes my personal experience of the COVID pandemic so far. Nayar writes in Bhopal's Ecological Gothic that the Bhopal texts foreground a social ontology of the Bhopali, one that slides from vulnerability to helplessness or a state of precariousness. It is an ecosystem and ecology wherein precarity is the order of the Bhopali day. The Bhopal Gothic, in its discourse of injurability, points less to the bodies of the victim than to the embedding of these bodies in specifically dangerous settings and environs haunted by a toxic past. That is, the Bhopal Gothic of toxic haunting, specters of destruction, and secrecy and repression is cathected, or in other words, invested with emotional energy onto human bodies and the body politic, both of which are thereby rendered precarious. Precarious subjects, individuals, constitute the precariat public sphere in Bhopal, even 30 years after the disaster. Bhopal instantiates a precarious cultural condition in its texts from 1984 to the present." End quote. What Nayar seems to be emphasizing in this passage is the idea that the physical environment of one specific place in the world, Bhopal, has come to represent not only toxicity, but precarity itself. Cultural texts, such as literature, film, and photography, play a particular role in reinforcing the cultural function of Bhopal, reminding society of the specters of destruction created by certain kinds of industrial activity. There is also, of course, a social justice aspect to the Bhopal story, just as there is in the case of COVID-19. Nayar turns to theorist Judith Butler's 2004 book, Precarious Life, The Powers of Mourning and Violence, to emphasize the fact that some lives are rendered more precarious, unlivable, and their deaths less grievable than others. Actually, I see there's a question about whether I'm sharing slides. I do not have slides, so I'm not sharing slides. I'm sorry, I don't have these words to put up on the screen. So I hope what I'm reading to you from my written text is possible to follow. I realize we are currently in the midst of the COVID pandemic. The experience has not receded into history, and yet even in the heart of this experience, our minds adjust to the new reality. There is a danger, even as our minds adjust to the new reality of the pandemic, there is a danger that we might become increasingly complacent and numb to the perils of the world, including the potential for even more expansive contagion. This is especially the case when we cannot see the danger around us. The sheer invisibility of the threat leads to insensitivity, and as Nayar describes it in the case of Bhopal, a kind of repression of knowledge and awareness. In a section of Bhopal's ecological Gothic titled Apprehension, Recognition, and the Repressed, Nayar points to the fact that a lot of information about the 1984 accident was secreted away in files and communications controlled by Union Carbide of India Limited and government officials. He refers to the idea of secret information and ambiguous information as a kind of textual uncanny, by which there is a societal repression of the information necessary for the public to remember and care about events like Bhopal. The alternative to repression is apprehension, or the cognitive grasping of a phenomenon or an experience. Judith Butler writes that apprehension is a form of knowing bound up with sensing and perceiving. We face a similar predicament with regard to our efforts to grasp and appreciate the meaning of the current pandemic, as much of the experience of the pandemic is hidden away in hospitals, the data secreted in government databases that are minimally available to the public. I don't know what the situation is in India regarding the availability of COVID information, but in the US, the government has been actively suppressing information in an appalling way that I've never seen previously, firing or otherwise silencing government officials who try to go public with information the administration deems detrimental to reopening the economy. Much of what Nayar claims about the secrecy related to the Bhopal accident and the efforts of subsequent journalists, artists, and writers to reveal secret information feels eerily relevant to the current experience we're all facing with regard to the pandemic. I wanted to mention, too, the compelling conclusion Nayar offers in his book on Bhopal, in which he discusses Raghu Rai's photograph titled Burial of an Unknown Child, analyzing the visual rhetoric of the image, which shows a hand appearing to brush dirt and stones from the face of a small child whose body is otherwise covered. As we look ahead to future textual representations of the pandemic we're now living through, we might stay alert to the use of jarring visual and narrative rhetoric of this kind, in which the normalcy and peril of our present moment might be captured. Nayar describes the dissonant, uncanny pairing of decorum and the grotesque captured by Rai's photograph as follows, quote, "There is a certain tenderness with which the hand brushes the mud and gravel around the child's face/head. The tenderness standing as a sharp contrast to the horrors of the 2nd and 3rd of December 1984 is gut-wrenching because it also signals a delicacy, a propriety toward the dead child, which the child was possibly never accorded in the moments of dying. There is, in the act captured in the photograph, a fantasy or illusion of decorum, which Bhopal did not possess or exhibit in the course of the disaster, nor was it allowed the victims or survivors. However, in the bleached, staring eyes of the dead child, the anonymity of identity sits oddly with the delicacy and propriety of the brushing hand. I suggest that what arrests us is this very conjunction of the delicate and proper with the grotesque. The image of the respected, dignified body being treated with care is an odd reminder of the sheer grotesque nature of the deaths of Bhopal, the contorted physiologies, choking and coughing to death, end quote. By exploring the aesthetic, ethical, rhetorical, and psychological nuances of textual representations of vulnerability in the context of the 1984 industrial disaster in Bhopal, Pramod Nayar offers a blueprint for how we might begin to understand the current public health crisis that is not confined to a single city or region on the planet, but is shared across continents and nations. The global dimension of the COVID pandemic is strikingly different than the Bhopal story, but in some ways, even a seemingly place-focused industrial disaster is actually more widespread than it may seem at first glance, representative as it is of a broader risk posed by modern technology and global capitalism. Nayar was clearly thinking of the psychology and aesthetics of precarity in a much broader sense, much broader context than the Bhopal story alone when he was working on the 2017 volume, as he shortly thereafter published the 2019 book, Ecoprecarity, Vulnerable Lives in Literature and Culture, which argues that the precariat, or those who experience precarity, include not only diverse human beings, but non-human subjects. He argues that the ecological disaster and eco-apocalypse, along with different states of eco-precarity, are central to contemporary environmentality, the term Lawrence Buell used in 2005 to describe the modes through which literary and cultural texts, from cinema to fiction, engage with ecological issues and concerns. The particular focus of the book Ecoprecarity is the contingent nature of the earth, which Nayar calls the beauty, fragility, and singularity of the planet we inhabit, which we stand to lose if we do not take care of our only home. End quote. In Ecoprecarity, Nayar ventures into the territory of a project I'm currently working on with my colleagues Swarnalata Rangaranjan from the Indian Institute of Technology in Madras and Vijay Sarveswaran from IIT Jodhpur, a handbook to medical environmental humanities that will include 30 chapters by scholars from throughout the world, attempting to understand various connections between human health and the external world, and also exploring the health and vulnerability of the non-human realm from the perspective of illness, injury, and well-being. Just as Pramod Nayar was able easily to adapt his analysis of human precarity to the broader planetary context in moving from the book Bhopal's Ecological Gothic to the more recent volume Ecoprecarity, there have long been efforts to use the rubric of health and medicine to characterize human interactions with nature. The idea is used, some might say co-opted, by an organization called Healing the Earth Incorporated that seeks to, quote, advance the health and natural wealth of our planet through investments that directly benefit the environment, the emerging green economy, and our shareholders, end quote. In recent months, a number of news organizations have also used the medical metaphor to describe what is happening environmentally as a result of the current pandemic, such as an April 2020 video titled, "Is COVID-19 Healing the Earth?" Again, using the medical idea of healing in relation to the recovery of the earth from human impacts because of our changed behavior during the pandemic. When Swarnalata, Vijay, and I approached potential contributors to the Medical Environmental Humanities Handbook, we invited them to try to explore human and planetary health in ways that go beyond the loose, symbolic idea of health in human and non-human contexts, using theories of disease, disrepair, treatment, recovery, and physical and mental well-being from various cultures around the world. Some 30 contributors will discuss the use of narrative medicine as a way of revealing the plight of victims of contaminated environments, the theories of embodiment that reveal the experience of prosthetic limb users, the complex environmental entanglements of multiple chemical sensitivity patients, and the linkages between mental illness and geographical displacement, among many other medical and environmental topics. Cultural lenses on the conjunctions between human health and the natural world range from traditional Sufi folk music from Turkey to Ayurvedic philosophy from India. The central goal of the project is to show how our ecological predicament, toxic land, water, and air, loss of species, diminished access to water and other resources needed for survival, and a changing climate that will fundamentally disrupt human life and many other life forms on the planet, is a simultaneous threat to human health. So the way we treat the environment is intimately and inevitably bound up with our own well-being and our own health. The special challenge in this project, I think, is to go beyond superficial analogies between human health and planetary health, which abound in popular culture. We have only begun to receive the actual chapter manuscripts for the book, but so far, the contributors seem to be doing a very good job of addressing the psychological and physical connections between environmental conditions and human health. Let me point to a few examples that I have at hand right now. Professor Jaru Chang from Brooklyn College in New York has drafted an essay titled, "We Are All in This Together: COVID Pathology, Scapegoat, and Hope, which seeks to understand COVID pathology from a range of perspectives, not only the biophysical one. She writes, quote, "Here we can see COVID pathology encompasses a wide range of pathological conditions, from biological infection from the virus and mental trauma to abnormal social behavior triggered by the pandemic." The chapter zooms in, her chapter, she says, zooms in on the prevalent racist and xenophobic attacks during the COVID pandemic and frames them as an example of social ideological COVID pathology. As a self-defense and coping strategy, an individual or community tends to find something or somebody to blame, either as a divine cosmic plot, such as Satan's work, or more mundanely, a political conspiracy theory. One of the most dangerous ideological pathologies is blaming and prompting hate crimes and violence against cultural and non-human others for the outbreak and mishandling of disease. End quote. As a Taiwanese scholar of Chinese culture living in the United States, Chang is particularly sensitive to the anti-Chinese response in this country as a way of scapegoating people associated with the country where COVID-19 originated. I don't know whether anything similar is happening in India, but at least in some circles, this kind of scapegoating is evident in the United States. Chang is also a specialist in critical animal studies, very sensitive to the relationships between humans and other species. So an important part of her study is also the section called Blaming the Animal Other, where she focuses on the zoonotic aspects of COVID, the fact that the disease is likely to have been transferred to humans from another animal species. She writes, quote, "Just as there is a reactionary game of blaming and stigmatizing infected or potentially infectious human bodies, so animals are not exempted from scapegoating. That is, whenever a zoonotic outbreak occurs, non-human animals are blamed as the cause, even before they are proven guilty." End quote. Professor Chang uses René Girard's scapegoat theory to explain the social process by which individuals or groups within society are singled out for undeserved blame and treatment, representing this as a common but dangerous psychological pathology. And that's the connection with the medical humanities. It's a psychological tendency that she finds unhealthy or pathological. And this is a pathology that many countries are experiencing at this very moment as a result of the pandemic. The environmental connections in this case result from the fact that the virus may well have originated in another animal species, although to my knowledge this has not yet been verified, and in the fact that certain kinds of animals, such as bats and pangolins, were quickly identified as the possible villains in allowing the disease to make the leap to human beings. Professor Chang concludes her article with an extended analysis, and this is where she focuses on her post-COVID hope, an analysis of what she calls a collective, multicultural, multi-species, post-humanist community, using post-humanist theory from Rosie Braidotti and others to suggest that we might benefit from the pandemic as an opportunity to, quote, learn how to coexist with the virus, end quote. She points as an example of this to a 2012 novel, well before the current pandemic, by Chinese writer and physician Bi Shumin, titled Coronavirus, in which Bi calls for, quote, respect for species' place in the web of life, and invokes a sense of humility and awe vis-a-vis the crisis, end quote. So in the case of this particular study by Jiaru Chang, the medical aspects involve not only the study of our responses to the current public health crisis, but a consideration of a broader pathology of blaming or scapegoating. The environmental aspect of Professor Tong's study includes our attitudes toward other living beings, including possibly carriers of the COVID crisis, such as bats and pangolins. There are a few other chapters for the handbook that also seem relevant to the COVID pandemic, such as Turkish scholar Gizem Yilmaz Karahan's essay titled Contagious History, The Imagination of Viruses, and French scholar Françoise Besson's essay Disseminating the Seeds of Words to Fight Spreading Disease, from Albert Camus' La Peste to Tony Hillerman's People of Darkness and The First Eagle. The full articles for this project, the Medical Environmental Humanities handbook, the articles are just beginning to arrive. And a few weeks ago, I received one from Heather Ramos, a doctoral student at Washington State University in the US, titled Revisiting Lord's Cancer Journals in the 21st Century, Resisting the Silent Passivity Surrounding Slow Violence, Environmental Toxins, and Systemic Racism. This article addresses not only the carcinogenic implications of contaminated physical environments, but the racist social structures and environmental injustice that lead to heightened exposures of particular groups of people, especially people of color, to these toxic environments. Ramos's study, while not focusing on the COVID pandemic, instead addresses the conjunction of the medical and environmental humanities by looking at the planetary crises of toxicity, injustice, and cancer. She shows how author Audre Lorde's 1980 book, Cancer Journals, helped to overcome silent passivity and raise awareness of this environmental and public health crisis. Rather than cataloging the many other articles that will be part of the forthcoming book on medical environmental humanities, I would like at this point to stop talking and hear some questions and comments from anyone who's been listening to this talk. What I've tried to suggest in various ways is that the COVID pandemic and various other crises we're experiencing have led to a broad sense of vulnerability or precarity that all of us are experiencing nowadays. I would repeat the Ramos essay, the title of the Ramos essay. The title is Revisiting Lorde's Cancer Journals in the 21st Century. Lorde is spelled L-O-R-D-E. It's the name of the author, Audre Lorde. And the subtitle of Ramos's essay is Resisting the Silent Passivity Surrounding Slow Violence, Environmental Toxins, and Systemic Racism. So I'm trying to suggest that the COVID pandemic and the various other crises I mentioned at the beginning of my talk that we're experiencing have led to a very broad sense of vulnerability or precarity that all or many of us are experiencing nowadays to some degree. Although certainly some people are much more vulnerable than others. I've also tried to probe a little bit the strange and even paradoxical combination of normalcy and peril that we're experiencing as we accustom ourselves to the new normal of the risky pandemic world. And I've attempted to sketch out, at least briefly, the possibility of bringing together an interest in human, physical, and mental health and our environmental concerns. This latter approach seems to be a valuable new angle in the interdisciplinary environmental humanities, in interdisciplinary environmental humanities more broadly, beyond environmental humanities. It may be one of the ways that the humanities can contribute something meaningful during a time of planetary crisis. So at this point, I'd like to thank you very much for listening to me present this talk to you. And now I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have about the talk itself or other subjects related to the pandemic or the environmental humanities, if I can. So thank you again for your attention, and now I'll turn this back to the moderators.
Thank you, Scott, for such a wonderful presentation.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I think there is a problem with the audio. Am I audible?
I can hear
You're
you.
audible.
Yes, I can hear you. You're audible.
Okay. By reviewing work by Pramod K. Nair and by previewing a project that Scott is engaged in along with two other scholars about the handbook of medical and environmental humanities that they are going to bring out soon. Actually, Professor Slovic has pointed out the points of convergence between medical and environmental humanities, and without analyzing it unnecessarily, I would now like to open the session for questions and comments from the members of the audience.
Will somebody be presenting these to me? Will someone be moderating the Q&A so that I know?
No,
Dr.
Scott, you
Sripendra
can-
Banerjee is going to moderate the session.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Amita. But I think the questions are visible to Scott as well. So the first question was from Shurasri, which I got disconnected and I missed that question.
I see them pop up on the screen very briefly, but then they fade away, and sometimes they're incomplete.
Fine. Yeah. Okay.
If
I've got it.
Shurasri can hear us, Shurasri can retype resubmit the question.
No, I've got it.
Okay.
So thank you for this wonderful session, sir. Eco-dystopian novels are mostly known to be too dark and even banned in several places. So my question is, can't we consider this fiction as a warning of an impending ecological apocalypse?
Yes, absolutely. I had never heard that eco-apocalyptic narratives had been banned in certain places. To my knowledge, they're not yet banned in the United States. I've been reading a lot of such narratives myself. In fact, I think there's a renewed popularity of such books in the United States and in other countries. I view apocalyptic warnings, not only of environmental apocalypse, but other kinds of potential destruction, as a very important role of literature and film and other art forms. The warning, or sometimes scholars refer to this as the Jeremiad, the warning mode, and it's really one of the central rhetorical perspectives in environmental texts of all kinds, not only specifically pertaining to pandemics, although recently many of us have been reading pandemic literature. I had never, prior to this year, had never even really thought about the genre of pandemic literature or pandemic novels, but now have become very interested in that, along with many other people. The pandemic novel that I've been reading most recently is a 2011 novel by the American writer Peter Heller called The Dog Stars, which writes about an influenza pandemic, and there are only a few people remaining alive after the pandemic, and it's about what the world is like after most people have died, including the wife of the protagonist of the novel is no longer around. He lives with his dog, just by himself in the mountains with his dog. And what I'm particularly interested, ironically, in this particular book and others, is the idea of that there may be certain beautiful things that we can continue to appreciate about the world that has become so destructive and dangerous, and how to walk a fine line between celebrating continued life and recognizing the fundamental danger of the world. I see a lot of questions are popping up, and so I'll try actually not to answer at excessive length so that I can get through many of these. Could I please hear another question?
Yes, yes. This is Nobida Anjum's question. Sir, what lessons can we learn about eco-precarity from the previous cases of epidemics, and how can disaster text help us cope and correct? So something that you were already trying to speak of.
Right, right. Thank you. Well, I think it's historians who can teach us about previous pandemics, and then there are novelists. What's her name? The novelist who, I forget the author's name right now, but there's a book called The Year of Wonders that I read a few months ago, a novel about the Black Plague in England centuries ago. And so we're looking sometimes historically at these previous pandemics and realizing sometimes it's hard to look at what's going on at this moment. And so viewing pandemics historically enables us to ask hard questions about the way people behaved and maybe the mistakes they made in protecting themselves and their communities that are more difficult for us to recognize in our own immediate surroundings. So looking at a historically distant pandemic might enable us to appreciate the practical strategies that worked or didn't work a little bit more easily than we can do in the context of our current situation. So that's one thing. Also, I think by looking at some of the previous pandemics where we see enormous numbers of people who suffered and enormous numbers of lives lost might enable us to be aware of the potential increasing threat. So far we've lost hundreds of thousands of people to the pandemic, but that's a fraction of who died in some previous pandemics. So really it could get much worse than it is, and we need to continue to be vigilant and careful in our lives. So we might learn to be patient and put up with ongoing lockdowns and other changes to our lifestyles when we realize that, dangerous as the current pandemic has been so far, it could still become much worse if we're not careful. Next question.
Yes, the next question is from Mariam Khatun. Sir, you said of the sense of uncanny or grotesque that results in a phase of eco-precarity. Is it this sense of uncanny that affects people's psychological health and determines the behavioral responses of people in such situations? The sense of the uncanny.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, Professor Nayar makes a big point about the uncanny. He has multiple chapters in his small book on different angles of the uncanny. So it's a little bit hard to summarize. It has different features to it. The idea of the uncanny in relation to the sense of vulnerability related to industrial accidents and other sorts of environmental danger. But as I understand it, the aspect of the uncanny, the psychological aspect, has a lot to do with dissonance, with things that are incompatible, that are put awkwardly together, like a sense of comfort and normalcy and a sense of danger and strangeness. That there's something about certain conditions, certain experiences that force us to confront things that don't really easily fit together in our own minds, like feeling at ease and feeling safe and feeling vulnerable and precarious at the same time. And that's what I was trying to suggest about my own sense that during the pandemic, many of us feel a kind of normalcy as we adapt to the changing circumstances of the pandemic. And at the same time, we're aware on some level in our consciousness of the dangerousness of the world and our own vulnerability to the danger of infection. So the uncanny comes in by way of the odd combination of these different sorts of psychological experience that don't fit together. And the good thing about that, the feeling of the uncanny, the experience of the uncanny, is it makes us pay attention. It's jarring and it's unsettling or upsetting, this dissonance, and that is a good thing, because and this is what artists and writers attempt to achieve in their work, to represent the uncanny in order to startle us and disturb us out of complacency, so that we pay deeper attention to the phenomenon that they're representing. So the uncanny is a positive form of aesthetic dissonance, in that it helps us to pay a healthy, appropriate attention to phenomena, as I understand it. Thank you. Next question, please.
Yes. Next question is from Shayon Parial, and it's a long question, but I'll keep it short. Can we see eco-precarity as an imagined loss of human self? That he refers to the zombies in the zombie films, and can these representations of constant transgression of the human body be seen as possibilities or a kind of a precariousness?
Very interesting question. I do, I'm not really an expert in the zombie genre, and I know a number of scholars have written about zombie literature and zombie film in the past, specifically in relation to other kinds of conditions of environmental change, climate change, and industrial toxicity and things like that, that result in a certain grotesque distortion of the so-called normal human self. So my sense is that one of the disquieting and upsetting aspects of the zombie is that zombies look like humans, but they're not behaving like normal humans. And so the grotesqueness of the zombie characters implies that that human nature has somehow been dissolved or changed, and is both recognizable and unrecognizable at the same time. So it definitely raises questions about human identity. I think it might be fruitful to think about the zombie genre in connection with posthumanism. The posthuman, if you have studied posthuman philosophy, studies the human phenomenon, the human identity, not as a discrete, separate phenomenon, but as some human identity is intricately connected to many other things, such as animals and machines, and potentially even with distortions such as the zombies. So our posthumanist philosophy would understand that human nature is diffuse and fluid, and represents many different tentacles of relationship beyond simply a narrow band of normal human physiology and behavior. So I think this question about zombie narratives and human identity could be very interesting to study in this post-human context. I hope that helps. Yes. Next question, please.
Thank you. No question yet, but I was just wondering, taking it away from precarity and the points that you were raising about the medical humanities, when we are referring to using a word like healing, so healing is very much related to the nature, to the ecology. Does it have a kind of a conflict with the present day medical sciences, or how would you like to see the relationship?
Let me try to answer if I understand correctly. And I don't know if you meant this specifically in relation to the pandemic and healing in the case of the pandemic. I mean, in a lot of modern ecological thinking, Healing implies that damage has occurred and that it must be corrected or brought back somehow, restored. We use the word restoration in the ecological context rather than healing. And so, there's a lot of ecologists operate in this restorationist mode, where we must correct the damage typically caused by human beings and restore environments and species back to some kind of supposed normalcy. Other people believe that changes in the environment are more neutral. They're not always negative, and that really it isn't the place of human beings to heal the environment or to correct these changes, that our change is inevitable in ecological systems, even if they're caused by human action, and that we should allow these changes to occur, and eventually natural systems will find some kind of equilibrium, whether or not we actively produce that equilibrium ourselves. I guess there must be certain medical philosophies too that suggest that we need not actively intervene and aggressively, invasively correct the medical condition of human patients, but rather we should allow the human body simply to rely upon its natural resources, its inherent processes of recovery, and not intervene aggressively with medical technologies or medical processes. So I think there are certain cultures that, even the Christian Science philosophy, which tends to avoid medical intervention, and I think that in a way accords with ecological thinking that tends to resist restorationist intervention. So this question of whether to intervene or not intervene occurs to me when I hear you raise these questions. I don't know if I'm following your specific point, but this is just what comes to mind as I think about it. Did any other questions arrive as we were waiting?
No, it's fine. Thank you. Okay, another question has just come in. So we'll take this last question. Scott, can we take this last question? Yeah.
Of course, thank you.
So recently, Black Lives Matter has voiced itself in the USA. My question is, does the COVID pandemic has any part to facilitate the protest by bringing in the racial discrimination, by projecting them as more vulnerable than the other communities?
Yeah, I think the fact that not only African Americans but other communities of color in the United States, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, and other such communities have proven to be more exposed and more vulnerable to the pandemic than other cultural groups in the United States. So I would say awareness of this unequal exposure and unequal vulnerability to the pandemic has provided a deeper sense of urgency to the Black Lives Matter protest. That's certainly an undercurrent within the Black Lives Matter protest, although it's not the only one. Obviously, there's a history of deep inequality in this country based on race and culture. And this inequality, unequal treatment, is particularly egregious and disturbing when it occurs at the hands of law enforcement. I'm sure many of you who followed this protest movement in the United States are aware of the brutal behavior of police who take an oath to protect the public. That means the entire public, regardless of background, regardless of race. The police officers are supposed to be protectors. They're not supposed to be attacking the public, mistreating the public, certainly not murdering the public in the name of public safety. And so all of the stories that we're now aware of terrible mistreatment of people of color at the hands of the police, that really was the trigger that spurred the development of the current protests. But it also has a link to what's going on with the pandemic and people awareness of the the way the lives of certain communities, cultural communities, makes them more exposed to the pandemic and less likely to have access to adequate medical care should they need it during this time of the pandemic. So it's definitely an important part of the protest movement, one of several major strands that have added a sense of urgency to this movement. So thank you for these excellent questions, very thoughtful responses specifically to what I said and to related topics. So I appreciate your attention and your careful wording of these questions.
Thank you, sir, for this. So Amida, you can now take over for the concluding comments.
Yes. Thank you, Scott, and thank you, dear audience, for such a wonderful, thought-provoking question and answer session. In fact, while before calling it a day, I should thank everyone for being here and for this lively exchange of ideas. Well, while listening to Somipendro's question and your answer, Scott, I was being reminded of a very good novel by Sri Lankan author Daya Dishanayake, The Healer and the Drug Pusher, where he questions the entire West-centric and commerce-driven medical regimes and actually talks about the two approaches, one of healing and another very invasive medical intervention, that drug pushing, that is Daya Dishanayake's metaphor. And I would recommend this book to the audience. You may read it. Now, I must thank Scott for raising such very wonderful issues, and I hope this will induce us to think about the relationship between medical humanities and environmental humanities on the one hand, and our responsibility to ourselves and the earth that we call home. So before we stop here, I must tell the audience that as part of this online lecture series, the next lecture that we will host will be on the 28th day of September, when Professor Marco Johan is going to talk about another very interesting topic, worldliness, world and worlding of literature. So I invite all of you to join us then. With this, we come to the end of this session. I must thank Scott for being with us, even though it is quite late over there. I wish you a very, very good night's sleep. Thank you.
Thank you, Amit, and thanks to all of you for your participation. It's been a pleasure. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.